Book 2, Chapter 1 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jordan. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Book the 2nd. Chapter 1. Lurking Mischief. 1. From Ozias Midwinter to Mr. Brock. Thorpe Ambrose, June 15, 1851. Dear Mr. Brock, only an hour since we reached this house, just as the servants were locking up for the night, Allan has gone to bed, worn out by our long day's journey, and has left me in the room they call the library, to tell you the story of our journey to Norfolk. Being better seasoned than he is to fatigues of all kinds, my eyes are quite wakeful enough for writing a letter, though the clock on the chimney-piece points to midnight, and we have been travelling since 10 in the morning. The last news you had of us was news sent by Allan from the Isle of Man. If I am not mistaken, he wrote to tell you of the night we passed on board the wrecked ship. Forgive me, dear Mr. Brock, if I say nothing on that subject until time has helped me to think of it with a quieter mind. The hard fight against myself must all be fought over again, but I will win it yet, please God, I will indeed. There is no need to trouble you with any account of our journeyings about the northern and western districts of the island, or of the short cruises we took when the repairs of the yacht were at last complete. It will be better if I get on at once to the morning of yesterday, the 14th. We had come in with the night tide to Douglas Harbour, and as soon as the post office was open, Allan, by my advice, sent on shore for letters. The messenger returned with one letter only, and the writer of it proved to be the former mistress of Thorpe Ambrose, Mrs. Blanchard. You ought to be informed, I think, of the contents of this letter, for it has seriously influenced Allan's plans. He loses everything, sooner or later, as you know, and he has lost the letter already. So I must give you the substance of what Mrs. Blanchard wrote to him, as plainly as I can. The first page announced the departure of the ladies from Thorpe Ambrose. They left on the day before yesterday, the 13th, having, after much hesitation, finally decided on going abroad to visit some old friends, settled in Italy, in the neighbourhood of Florence. It appears to be quite possible that Mrs. Blanchard and her niece may settle there too, if they can find a suitable house and grounds to let. They both like the Italian country and the Italian people, and they are well enough off to please themselves. The elder lady has her jointure, and the younger is in possession of all her father's fortune. The next page of the letter was, in Allan's opinion, far from a pleasant page to read. After referring in the most grateful terms to the kindness which had left her niece and herself free to leave their old home at their own time, Mrs. Blanchard added that Allan's considerate conduct had produced such a strongly favourable impression among the friends and dependents of the family that they were desirous of giving him a public reception on his arrival among them. A preliminary meeting of the tenants on the estate and the principal persons in the neighbouring town had already been held to discuss the arrangements, and a letter might be expected shortly from the clergyman, inquiring when it would suit Mr. Armadale's convenience to take possession, personally and publicly, of his estates in Norfolk. You will now be able to guess the cause of our sudden departure on the Isle of Man. The first and foremost idea of your old pupil's mind, as soon as he had read Mrs. Blanchard's account of the proceedings at the meeting, was the idea of escaping the public reception, and the one certain way he could see of avoiding it was to start for Thorpe Ambrose before the clergyman's letter could reach him. I tried hard to make him think a little before he acted on his first impulse in this matter, but he only went on packing his portmanteau in his own impenetrably good-humoured way. In 10 minutes his luggage was ready, and in 5 minutes more he had given the crew their directions for taking the yacht back to Somersetshire. The steamer to Liverpool was alongside of us in the harbour, and I had really no choice but to go on board with him, or to let him go by himself. I spare you the account of our stormy voyage, of our detention at Liverpool, and of the trains we missed on our journey across the country. You know that we have got here safely, and that is enough. What the servants think of the new squire's sudden appearance among them without a word of warning is of no great consequence. What the committee for arranging the public reception may think of it when the news flies abroad tomorrow is, I am afraid, a more serious matter. Having already mentioned the servants, I may proceed to tell you that the latter part of Mrs. Blanchard's letter was entirely devoted to instructing Allan on the subjects of the domestic establishment, which she has left behind her. It seems that all the servants, indoors and out, with 3 exceptions, are waiting here on the chance that Allan will continue them in their places. 2 of these exceptions are readily accounted for. Mrs. Blanchard's maid and Miss Blanchard's maid go abroad with their mistresses. The 3rd exceptional case is the case of the upper housemaid, and here there is a little hitch. In plain words, the housemaid has been sent away at a moment's notice, for what Mrs. Blanchard rather mysteriously describes as levity of conduct with a stranger. I am afraid you will laugh at me, but I must confess the truth. I have been made so distrustful, after what happened to us in the Isle of Man, of even the most trifling misadventures which connect themselves in any way with Allan's introduction to his new life and prospects, and I have already questioned one of the men servants here about this apparently unimportant matter of the housemaid's going away in disgrace. All I can learn is that a strange man had been noticed hanging suspiciously about the grounds, that the housemaid was so ugly a woman as to render it next to a certainty that he had some underhand purpose to serve in making himself agreeable to her, and that he has not as yet been seen again in the neighbourhood since the day of her dismissal. So much for the one servant who has been turned out at Thorpe Ambrose. I can only hope there is no trouble for Allan brewing in that quarter. As for the other servants who remain, Mrs. Blanchard describes them, both men and women, as perfectly trustworthy, and they will all, no doubt, continue to occupy their present places. Having now done with Mrs. Blanchard's letter, my next duty is to beg you, in Allan's name and with Allan's love, to come here and stay with him at the earliest moment when you can leave Somersetshire. Although I cannot presume to think that my own wishes will have any special influence in determining you to accept this invitation, I must nevertheless acknowledge that I have a reason of my own for earnestly desiring to see you here. Allan has innocently caused me a new anxiety about my future relations with him, and I sorely need your advice to show me the right way of setting that anxiety to rest. The difficulty which now perplexes me relates to the steward's place at Thorpe Ambrose. Before today, I only knew that Allan hit on some plan of his own for dealing with this matter, rather strangely, involving, among other results, the letting of the cottage which was the old steward's place of abode, in consequence of the new steward's contemplated residence in the great house. A chance word in our conversation on the journey here led Allan into speaking out more plainly than he had spoken yet, and I heard, to my unutterable astonishment, that the person who was at the bottom of the whole arrangement about the steward was no other than myself. It is needless to tell you how I felt this new instance of Allan's kindness. The first pleasure of hearing from his own lips that I had deserved the strongest proof he could give of his confidence in me was soon dashed by the pain which mixes itself with all pleasure, at least with all that I have ever known. Never has my past life seemed so dreary to look back on as it seems now, when I feel how entirely it has unfitted me to take the place of all others that I should have liked to occupy in my friend's service. I mustered courage to tell him that I had none of the business knowledge and business experience which his steward ought to possess. He generously met the objection by telling me that I could learn, and he has promised to send to London for the person who has already been employed for the time being in the steward's office, and who will, therefore, be perfectly competent to teach me. Do you, too, think I can learn? If you do, I will work day and night to instruct myself. But if, as I am afraid, the steward's duties are of far too serious a kind to be learned off-hand by a man so young and so inexperienced as I am, then pray hasten your journey to Thorpe Ambrose, and exert your influence over Allan personally. Nothing less will induce him to pass me over, and to employ a steward who is really fit to take the place. Pray act in this matter, as you think best for Allan's interests. Whatever disappointment I may feel, he shall not see it. Believe me, dear Mr. Brock, gratefully